Now, let me situate this problematic in time. It's about the issue of how it is that human beings became the moral beings with the particular moral visions that have arisen over time in history, and particularly the ones that we're living with today around the notion of democracy and universal human rights. How did it happen? What has to be understood as the causes pushing it in this direction? All these issues need to be attacked. And the only game in town, as it were, recently, in the recent centuries, to even begin to talk about this, was theories of the Enlightenment, Aufklärung, les Lumières, so on, which were in some ways radically deficient. I want to argue as a sidebar of this, the development of this theory is to look at some of the inadequacies of them. But very recently, no one can explain really why this happens, latter couple of decades of the 20th century, a number of very important scholars began to look at this history in the light of the history of civilizations. And I want to mention particularly the Israeli scholar Shmuel Eisenstadt and the Icelandic scholar Johan Aronsson. See, it comes from small countries, who started off a certain number of lines of thought. Now, Shmuel started off the line of thought, which went back to another major figure I want to mention here, who wrote at the end of the Second World War, and that's Karl Jaspers. And Karl Jaspers laid down this theory of the axial period, a moment in history, roughly the middle of the last millennium BCE, in which in a number of different civilizations, similar movements arose, which opened new ethical directions and possibilities in a very clear way. This is very mysterious phenomenon, as he points out, because they're quite different from each other, but at the same time they have a great deal of affinity between them. And on top of that, we can't explain the affinities very easily by the ordinary process of diffusion in history. It isn't that Confucius had a friend who wandered over to India and whispered in the ear of Buddha, or the other way around. They seem to be happening, this seems to be happening with very similar impact at roughly the same time without it being possible. Now, those of you who watched the other night Rupert Sheldrake, I think there's something here for his conception of morphological resonance somehow. There's some way in which these different civilizations were drawn together around these insights, something circulated in a way which we don't understand in the ordinary process of diffusion. And so that's one speculation. It's just a speculation which lies at the back of this. The other speculation is there's a very old tradition in Christian theology, which goes back to St. Irenaeus, that of the divine pedagogy by God of the human race, of human beings, and perhaps we could see this also as a trace of that. Okay, well, let me jump in and say, what were these common elements? First of all, what were the civilizations? Well, the civilizations, maybe there are others that could be added, but the ones that Jaspers concentrated on were the Greeks at the epoch of the philosophers, say, Greeks around Socrates and Plato's time. Israeli society at the time of the prophets. The Indo-Gangetic plain at a roughly the same period, but let's take the Buddha's life as an exemplary point of that. And in the Chinese case, Confucius. Okay, what do these four interventions have in common? Well, the first is that they arise in civilizations where people's understanding of right and wrong, what's good and bad, were really determined by the culture of those civilizations. And what these interventions did, let's say, Plato, the prophets, the Buddha, and Confucius, all in different ways, was opened the standpoint of, if you like, universality, whereby you could criticize and alter the major norms of this society in the name of something which was universally human. Not that they developed very highly this notion of universality, but obviously they were speaking from outside in the name of what was good as such in human life, and saying certain elements of what are considered to be top values in this society have to be revised. So this, if you like, critical stance, the moment of a critical stance. Another feature of these thinkers was that their thought was very much oriented towards the good of human beings. In other words, there was a benevolent stance towards the human person here. That the goal ought to be to make life better for human beings as such, rather than some other goal which interfered with this that was in power in those societies. So these two features continue. Now, these two features have another third feature in common, which is very important, which is that what these figures offered as their critique was never totally final. That is, they started a line of critique which could be radicalized by other thinkers afterwards, right? So if you begin to think in terms of the prophets, for instance, that it's not enough just to obey the ritual law, it's not enough just to go through the right sacrifices and so on. Something more is required, like justice, you know. Take care of the widows and the orphans, right? It launches you into a notion of justice, but then that notion of justice can itself be questioned. I mean, it's something that, if you like, invite somebody else to come along and say, well, look, if you really want to get the just and proper way, you'd have to look at it differently. And of course, that is very, very clear in the case of Plato, right? That we have this notion of dikaosune, of justice, which he's trying to give us an idea about by, you know, the dialogue of the Republic, but it's by its very nature opening itself to, and Aristotle will pick it up, and others will pick it up, saying, well, that's not quite right, it's this. And so you get this, if you like, self-radicalization, or it's opening a kind of channel of further radical reevaluations, right? So something, it's got a dynamism built into it. So, okay, now let's look at some features of what results from this. Well, what's interesting is that it isn't this makes it very relevant, my last point of the self-radicalization. We don't arrive right away at a final goal for what human beings should be doing. What we do is we open a kind of path. And at the beginning, there's a very mitigated way of receiving this message. The message was received as something that could only be fully lived up to by exceptional individuals. So exceptional individuals introduce this message, but they also introduce a message of such radicality that lots of people, most people accept that this can't be lived by everybody.